All right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time of day you're listening to this. We're shooting this morning. It's Saturday morning, January 19th, because we're about to have a snowstorm. And so if you're watching this over the weekend sometime, maybe Sunday, maybe Monday if you have the day off, would love it if you'd just treat this like a snow day and spend some time with God, time with your family, and make it kind of a sweet break for you. And so we're in this series at the Canal Fulton campus called Twisted. And so we're going to go through, we're going to kind of do a shortened version of the topic for this week. But Twisted is really the idea that there are verses throughout the Bible, many of them, where people have taken them over the years and just what we're talking about, twisted them to maybe make them mean something they were never intended to mean. So we've been talking about that for a couple weeks. And this week, we're actually on the verse Jeremiah 29:11. And so one of the things I'm going to encourage you to do during this teaching time is press the pause button while I'm talking. Stop it at some point. And, now might be a good time to go grab a Bible, go get the YouVersion set up on your iPhone or iPad, and turn to right now Jeremiah 29:11, really chapter 29. We'll see a couple things in there, and so anytime during this video you want to press pause, maybe have a conversation if you're sitting there with somebody, maybe your family, and talk about this. I'd really encourage you to treat this like this. It's not really going to be a sermon so much as a conversation, I hope, about Jeremiah 29:11. And I'll be looking at my notes a little bit. It's Saturday morning, so I haven't got this memorized like I might have normally, but bear with me. So Jeremiah 29:11, and we can read it together. So if you're looking at it, it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." So if we were sitting together, I would ask you the question, have you heard that verse before, ever? And it's unbelievable because we have a few things around our house that are, coffee mugs and paintings on the wall. And that is, Jeremiah 29:11 gets put on coffee mugs and blankets and wall hangings, and it's out there. This verse has almost made its way into pop culture in the United States. For I know that plans I have for you, plans for good and for a future, not to harm you. Like that idea, that concept, that verse has really made its way into many people's lives. So this would be a good time to maybe, you could hit pause and have a discussion, and I would just ask you the question, what do you think that means when God says, I have plans for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future? So you could talk about that a little bit if you wanted to. I think if you did just see that verse, you'd come away thinking, God's gonna take care of me. He's for me, and maybe even something like the closer I get to God. So if my relationship with Him gets closer and closer, better and better things are going to happen to me. And your mind would probably go to money and relationships and life circumstances and maybe your house. And I think it would not be unfair if that's all you had to look at to come away and go, oh yeah, He's got some good things in mind for my future, and I would go there. It's funny how in many ways you can divide a lot of, especially country songs, maybe more general than that, into two different categories. Songs that are like, hey, here's what life would look like if you were prospering. And actually, this is funny, you're going to laugh at me, but so I like country music. Blake Shelton has a song called I'll Name the Dogs. And honestly, I was just driving down the road this morning and that song came on and I listened to the lyrics and I was like, oh yeah, that sounds like a pretty good life. Like really, that's literally one of the lines in the song. And to me, it actually does. I couldn't name why I like that song until we were having this conversation. I was thinking about this stuff. But the other side of country music is what's life like when it's not prospering? It's bad. It's awful. Things have been taken away. And you could almost, that's like the country music genre in prospering, not prospering. Yeah, it's funny. Part of the problem, so we live now I just heard a stat a couple weeks ago that was the average person is hearing currently 2018-19 1,500 to 3,000 messages a day in terms of media input. Like, that is staggering, first of all. But, most of those are in some way connected. They're trying to connect to your idea of whatever you think prospering means. They're trying to hit that nerve in you and go, ooh, I think that thing or this picture of the future or this house, or like will hit the nerve of, hey, this is what prospering means. Come buy this and you'll have it, right? So all of this is kind of flying around, and you see it everywhere. And so that verse, whether you see it on a refrigerator magnet or a pillow or a coffee mug, it like hits a nerve. Like, yeah, I want to prosper. I'm glad God is for me, and he has that same thing in mind. So Jeremiah 29:11, we're going to talk about that now just for a few minutes, and we're going to go through the three things that Kyle talked to us about last week. They're really important. One of the most important things when you start to look at the Bible and you try to figure out what it means, especially if you're looking at a specific verse, is you've got to ask the question, what is the context of this verse? Like, what's it sitting in? Like, what was the story it was in? Really important. Second question right on the heels of that is, okay, what does the whole Bible say on this topic? So context, and then what's the whole Bible say? Like, let the Bible help you interpret the Bible. And then, of course, God never wants you to stop there. He wants you to actually do something about whatever it is you read or understand now. So if you go to Jeremiah 29:1, back at the first verse there, it says, "This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." So one of the context pieces here for sure is the whole letter of Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. It is written to people, God's chosen holy nation, the nation of the Jews, Israel, that had been sent into exile. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had captured them, but God had really allowed this to happen, even set it in motion, because the nation of Israel had been so disobedient, disloyal, really turning their backs on him, worshiping other gods that were, fake, made of stone concepts. They had really just left him behind, turned their back on him, and God said, okay, if that's the way you want it, I'll give you over. This is kind of the pattern you see over and over in the Old Testament is God says, I want to be your God. I want you to be my people. I want you to trust me. I'll take care of you. And like, no, we'd rather do things our own way. So this had gone on and on, but finally God says, okay, here's what's going to happen then, if you really want to be away from me. So they're in exile, and the promise was that was going to be about a 70-year period, because they had really, if you read some of the stories in the Old Testament, it was blatant rebellion and pushing God away, and just, it was painful. But when you read it, you understand, like, hey, this is what I'm doing with God probably on a daily basis. So God says, okay, 70 years you're going to be captive by another nation. And so that's the context this is sort of written in. And when Jeremiah 29:11 is written, it is written to an entire nation. This is one of the things to make sure you understand in context. It is not written to an individual. It's not written to you personally necessarily. It's written to an entire nation. And it's in the context of them. They're really in the middle of a kind of a discipline, punishment, God letting them, okay, that's what you want, go do whatever you want. But God's posture has always been, and this is what's so beautiful about the story from beginning to end, Genesis through Revelation, kind of the posture of, I'll be here waiting when you're ready to return. Like if you will humble yourself, I'll be here. So that's Jeremiah 29:11 in its context. So you might assume it's just written to every individual, I have plans to prosper you, and that might be true at some level, but this verse does not really mean that. It is written to the whole nation. God has plans for them, a future for them. Basically, he's not giving up on them, which is part of the incredible good news that is for us and really is mentioned all kinds of other places. But in this context of prospering, there was if you go back to Jeremiah 28, you could read this sometime, there was actually a false prophet. Jeremiah is a prophet. Prophet just means somebody who is speaking for God. There was a false prophet named Hananiah. He came to the people. Turned out he said he was speaking for God. He was not. And he told them, he's like, hey, I know God said this was going to be 70 years. Actually, in 2 years, the nation of Babylon is going to crumble. You'll be free. This will all be over. But it was not true. And Jeremiah came back on the scene and said, hey, no, God has said 70 years. That's what it's going to be. But he'll be waiting for you then. But prospering in this case doesn't mean this is going to be over right away. You're going to still be in pain. This will be difficult. And, sometimes in life this is because we're living out our own consequences, as was the case here. Other times it's just the fact that we live in a messed up, broken world that is not the way God intended. In either case, I think the message is the same. Be patient. God's idea of prospering is not the same as yours, and his timeline probably for prospering doesn't exactly match yours all the time. But this, like the false version of this is what you might call the health and wealth gospel. This is the church or the speaker, someone says, hey, the closer you get to God, the better your life is going to be. Or, give us $100 and God's going to give you 1,000. He will prosper you. And, at one level, you could imagine how this could make sense. I mean, imagine there was like a really good-hearted CEO that was leading Timken or Diebold or Amazon and you started in the company and you kept moving up the ranks and he's the president CEO, and as you get closer to him in terms of your role and his reliance on you, your relationship with you, you're like, oh, my life is going to get better the closer I get to the leader of this thing. I can understand how that would make sense, but in many cases that's not what God has exactly in mind. We'll see if we can understand this just a little bit in the few minutes that we have. And so, part of the problem is, if this is true, the closer you get to God, the better life is going to be. You got some really hard things to sort through. Even in the present, you watch a lot of godly people who are really, unless they're really fooling us, they're incredibly godly people, yet life is very, very difficult. Cancer, hardship, job loss, losing their house even, and you go, I don't know. Or even more so, precisely because they're Christians. Maybe in other countries, Syria, for example, a woman becomes a Christian and she's a mom and her life gets worse because she is following Jesus, getting closer to him. And so, I get it. This is going on to me all the time. So that everybody, including me, wants a God who's going to give us happiness without pain, kind of holiness without any kind of suffering or trials that go with it. I want that. Sometimes I puzzle like, oh God, why did you make the world any other way? Because that's the way I would make it. Like, just make me mature and holy. And so if you're trying to understand what Jeremiah 29:11 means, God's plans to prosper for good, not to harm you, and you think it means the closer you get to him, the better life is going to get. If you go look at the rest of the Bible, you can just start with some of the stories in there and look at, Joseph. If you go back and look at the life of Joseph, huge part of the book of Genesis is devoted to the story of Joseph. Go back and read it if you don't know it. But his life is hard. He's counted as a faithful man, a man after God's heart. His life gets hard. He's enslaved. He's mistreated. He's mistrusted. He's put on. He's almost executed multiple times. I mean, it is just one good news, bad news story after another in the life of Joseph. And then you go to, so what is, if God had plans to prosper Joseph, what's that mean? Paul, life of Paul, perhaps other than Jesus, the most godly, intentionally, kingdom-minded person who's ever lived. His story in the New Testament is like one suffering story after another. He's out of money, he's beaten, he's ridiculed, he's mocked, he's put in prison, he's eventually executed. But what's God's definition of Paul, I have plans to prosper you. And then, I guess you could ask the story fairly, or ask the question of the life of Jesus, his story, fairly or unfairly, like, did Jesus prosper? Well, he's eventually beaten, ridiculed, jailed for a small amount of time, and killed by the time he's 33. So you got to fit these pieces together. So this is part of, so you look at even like 2 Timothy 3:12. You can pause there and look that up if you want to. 2 Timothy 3:12. In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. It's crazy. There's like 70,000 Christians, they estimate, in concentration camps in North Korea. So what does Jeremiah 29:11 have to do with them? Because it's got to make sense, and it's got to be true for them, just like it is for us in North America, if it's true, if we're finding out what the truth is. And so you could even pause there and say, hey, for a Christian in a concentration camp in North Korea, when God says, Jeremiah 29:11, I have plans to prosper you, not to harm you, for good, not for evil, what do you think that means? You could stop here and have a conversation if you wanted. Philippians 1:29, it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. So in some way, God's plan for us that somehow in the context of prospering us says that part of the thing I get to do in God's definition of prospering for me is I get to somehow, some way, small ways, maybe big ways, I get to suffer for Christ. I have a good friend, Dan, up in Cleveland, and like one of his, he actually prays this sometimes to God, like, God, I hope I get to suffer for you sometime before I die. Like, oh. Like, what does God have in mind when he says, I have plans to prosper you? So the exiles, if you're in Jeremiah's context, you're exiled in another country, you want this to be over soon. You just do. And so they were very inclined to believe the guy who said to them, hey, this is going to be over soon. Jeremiah's like, wait, no, it's not. So verse 11, God has said 70 years, but verse 12 says, so I have plans to prosper you, verse 11. Verse 12 says, then, after the 70 years, you'll call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You'll seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I'll be found by you. So, somehow God's version of prospering has very much to do with relationship with him. And so, it's not just that he's going to give you everything you want, it's that he means for you and he to have some kind of really special, really deep trust relationship. Father-son, father-daughter, where your identity and hope and security is coming from him. We've talked about this many times in the past. That is his dream. I'll be your God and you'll be my man, you'll be my woman. Like that is what he wants to say. But there's no promise that it's all going to be easy now. It seems like the opposite. James 1, 2, 3, 4 says, when troubles come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. Because when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. Philippians 1:6, be confident of this, God who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day Christ returns. So if you just read James 1, 2 through 4 and Philippians 1:6, what do you notice there about God's definition of what he has in mind to prosper you? Like how would that fit? And there's almost a sense in which getting anything you wanted almost is the opposite of you prospering. And you can get a glimpse of this when some really wealthy people, Ross Perot, Warren Buffett, and the guy who founded George Pillsbury, they all had this thing in common where they were really careful about the wealth they passed on to their kids. And they were trying to give them just enough so they wouldn't have to strain to get through life, but not too much that it would cripple them. And there seems to be a piece of this here with God's definition of prosper is like, I want to make sure that that they have the chance to develop. So God's going to give you almost like just enough to take care of you. He's going to be with you. And you watch this in the lives of the Christians and the people in the Bible, and in the lives of people around you who are godly. Like he gives them just what they need at the right time, in the hopes that, so the relationship with him is really a big piece of what it means, his idea to prosper you. So you grow into this incredibly free, secure relationship, father-son, father-daughter, and at the same time, he develops you into the person you were meant to be. Those are two big things loaded in God's definition of prospering. And so giving you everything you might even think you want at this point is not really helpful. You can see that with dads and moms passing on wealth to their kids. Kids, you can think about this with pets you own. If you just let your dog come in and eat all the food he wants, like that's eventually not going to be good for your dog. The word spoiled literally means rotten. So it's actually the opposite of prospering. So it's almost like, let me just finish with one thing God's been telling me that I think is connected as I was praying about this for me and for you. So God's definition of prosper has something to do with my relationship with him, my dependence on him, and then it's almost like he's getting me ready. He's trying to make me into the man who could handle it when he gives me my wildest dreams. I don't know if that makes any sense, but right now I think God knows if he gave me everything I wanted, first of all, that's a twisted picture, and two, I couldn't handle it if he gave me everything I wanted. So he's trying to make me into a man who can really handle this. I think that's deeply connected in the New Testament picture, and the fact is you and I are in this story right now, and we're growing in our, what one guy has called our joyful dependence on the Father. And that's deeply rooted in God's picture of prospering. All right, let me finish with one thought, one challenge as you talk about this, and that would be, we're going to, starting February 3rd, so it's coming up in a few weeks, but we're going to start this scripture reading plan. There's actually an intro video that's attached to this same email. You can find it on our website at rivertreecanalfulton.com. But what it's going to do, it's going to take us through the entire Bible in a year, but then it's going to do it in a way that demonstrates how this is all one woven story with Jesus at the center. You and I are part of it, and God's really his wide-angle lens on what it means to prosper, what he's doing with humanity, what he's wanting to do with us. We're going to be part of this story, and he's making us into the kind of people that he can trust with big pieces of his universe going forward when this all comes to fruition. So we're going to read that together. I encourage you to go check out that video. There's an app that goes with it you can start looking at, downloading, and we're going to get started with this in February. So I hope you have a great week. Hope the snow day is a great benefit to you, your time with God, your family, your rest, and we will see you soon.